The key turned quietly in the lock, but her heartbeat thundered loud enough to make her wonder if the neighbors could hear it. The door creaked open to a familiar stillness, too still. No television murmuring in the background, no angry pacing. Just silence, heavy and unnatural. She stepped inside, the echo of her heels against the hardwood floor almost mocking her. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, from the diffuser he always kept by the entry table. She used to love that smell. Now it irritated her. Everything irritated her lately. She shut the door gently. The sound of the latch felt final in a way that made her chest tighten. The living room was dark, the blinds half open, city lights spilling in patches onto the floor. She hadn't meant to be out that long. She had told herself it would be a drink, maybe two. That was it. But his hands had been warm, his voice soft, his attention intoxicating. The kind of attention she hadn't felt in years. The kind her husband had once given her. Before his eyes grew cold, before everything she said became an argument, a flaw to fix, a reason to punish her with silence. She slipped off her shoes and walked quietly through the hallway. The bedroom door was closed. Her breathing quickened. Was he awake? Waiting to confront her? She braced herself, guilt already crawling up her throat like bile. But then she noticed something. The hallway light was on. That light was never on. She turned toward the living room, flicked on the main switch. That's when she saw it. A suitcase. Neatly packed, zipped. Next to it, on the coffee table, a cream-colored envelope with her name written in block letters. Her stomach dropped. She stared at it, trying to make sense of the setup. The suitcase looked too familiar. Not hers. His. But the envelope, that was for her. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them. She picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, formal, like it came from a lawyer's office. Her name was written in ink that hadn't smudged. Not rushed. Planned. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside were 2 sheets. One was a typed letter. The other, divorce papers. She stood frozen, eyes darting between the words and the suitcase. Her mind raced. He knew. He had known. The entire day, while she'd been flirting with the idea of freedom in someone else's arms, he had been preparing an exit. Or worse, a performance. Her eyes locked on the first line of the letter. I hoped you wouldn't do what I always knew you would. That sentence alone sucked the air out of the room. She read on. I gave you everything. I made you who you are. And still, you proved me right. Each word felt like a slap. Not because they were true, but because they were written with such calm cruelty, designed to penetrate. This wasn't heartbreak. This was calculation. This wasn't letting go. This was control. One last act of superiority. One final twist of the knife. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He left her a letter laced with poison. The words kept going. You'll find your freedom now, just like you always said you wanted. I won't stop you. I won't chase you. But don't think this makes you powerful. You lost the right to be the victim the moment you decided to lie. Tears burned her eyes, but none fell. She dropped the letter on the table like it had scorched her fingers. Her jaw clenched. Of course he knew. He always knew how to get into her head. How to twist her shame into something he could feed on. This was his revenge. Not public, not loud, but private, devastating, surgical. He wanted her to question everything. Not just what she did tonight, but who she was. She backed away from the suitcase. No sign of him. Not in the bedroom, not in the house at all. He was gone. And somehow, that was worse than a fight. She sat down slowly on the couch. Her reflection in the blank TV screen stared back at her. Messy hair, smeared lipstick, eyes wide and tired. The woman staring back didn't look like a cheater. Didn't look like a villain. She looked broken. Confused. Lonely. The silence pressed in on her again. This wasn't about the fling. It never was. This had started long before that bar, that stranger. This started the first time she apologized for crying. The first time he criticized her laugh. The first time he told her she was lucky he put up with her moods. It started when she believed him. She looked at the divorce papers again. A clean cut. A way out. And yet, even that felt like a trap. He wasn't releasing her. He was branding her. Marking her as the failure. He wanted her to walk away carrying the weight of guilt he handed her like a gift. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't realize something. She had already been carrying guilt for years. For falling short. For staying. For wanting more. For needing to breathe. Now she was just tired. And for the first time, maybe that wasn't a weakness. Maybe that was the beginning. He didn't start this way. That's the part she keeps coming back to. There was a time she believed she had found the one. He was charming, attentive, always knew the right things to say. Their first few months felt like something out of a well-written romance. The kind that made you believe love could be soft and safe. He opened doors, remembered her favorite coffee order, kissed her forehead like it meant something. It wasn't love at first sight. It was love after consistency. He showed up. And that alone felt like a miracle in a world of empty promises. She thought she'd finally gotten it right. When he proposed, there was no hesitation. There were red flags, sure. But back then, they looked more like quirks. Maybe a little jealous. Maybe a little controlling. But nothing she couldn't manage. And besides, she thought, maybe love just meant compromise. Compromise turned into silence. At first, the arguments were normal. Every couple fights. But slowly, they started to change. He never yelled. He didn't have to. He withdrew. He punished her with distance. With stares that lasted too long. With a coldness that wrapped around her spine every time she opened her mouth to speak. He criticized in ways that felt like concern. You sure you want to wear that? You get emotional too fast. People won't take you seriously. You need to stop being so sensitive. She believed him. Believed she was hard to love, too fragile, too much. She stopped calling her friends. He didn't tell her to. He just made her feel guilty for leaving him alone. So she stayed. She gave up girls' nights, weekends with family, morning runs. All the little things that made her feel like herself. Bit by bit, she disappeared. She told herself it was marriage. Sacrifice. Maturity. He controlled the finances by default. I'm just better with money, he said. This way you don't have to worry about anything. At first, it felt like protection. Later, it felt like a leash. There were no bruises. No screaming. Just a slow erasure of identity wrapped in logic and affection. The hardest part wasn't the abuse. It was the confusion. She kept asking herself if it was really that bad. He never hit her. He didn't cheat. He provided. What right did she have to feel this empty? Sometimes he'd switch back, be the man she married for a day, an hour, a smile. Just enough to keep her hoping. She lived off scraps of kindness. Off the way he'd brush her hair off her face when she was sick. Off the way he'd rub her back after a nightmare. It was never all bad. That's what made it dangerous. They tried counseling once. He sat through the sessions like a martyr, painting her as dramatic and impulsive. She cried in front of the therapist and felt ashamed afterward. On the drive home, he said she embarrassed him. She never brought it up again. She lost weight. Friends began to ask if she was okay. She said yes with a smile so practiced it hurt. She stopped making eye contact. Stopped wearing color. She began to exist in grayscale. He noticed when she started pulling away. Not all at once, just small things. She'd go for walks alone. She picked up a journal again. Started working from cafes, savoring the presence of strangers. It didn't go unnoticed. That's when he turned on the charm again. Late-night texts saying he missed her. Surprise lunches. A necklace she once mentioned in passing. It worked for a little while. Until it didn't. There was no grand betrayal, no sudden realization. Just a slow, suffocating recognition that she was miserable, and nothing was changing. She tried to talk to him one last time, told him she wasn't happy. His face didn't even flicker. "No one's happy all the time," he said. "That's life. You just want too much." That night she sat on the bathroom floor for hours. Fully clothed, lights off, back against the tub. Staring at nothing. Feeling everything. She didn't plan to cheat. It wasn't revenge or rebellion. It was escape. She met him at a networking event. Just a smile at first. A laugh. Then a drink. A conversation that felt like breathing. Someone who looked at her like she was still visible. It felt dangerous. And exhilarating. And wrong. And inevitable. The messages that followed weren't graphic. They were soft. They were curious. They were full of the warmth she hadn't felt in years. The night it happened, she didn't dress up. She didn't wear lipstick. It wasn't about seduction. It was about feeling like a woman again. The touch was different. Gentle. Reverent. As if he was grateful to hold her. She cried after. He asked if she was okay. She said yes, even though it wasn't true. She wasn't okay. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel numb. On the way home, she hated herself. Not for what she did, but for what she had become. A version of herself she didn't recognize. A woman who had once believed in loyalty, in commitment, in the promise that love could endure. And yet, somewhere deep down, she also felt relief. Not because of the affair. But because she finally understood. She had been trying to save a marriage that had already buried her. Her guilt wasn't about cheating. It was about admitting that she no longer belonged to the life she had fought so hard to maintain. By the time she walked through the door that night, her mind was a battlefield. And the silence she found waiting wasn't peace. It was war in disguise. The letter was still on the table, but her eyes had stopped seeing the words. They looped in her mind anyway. "I gave you everything. You lost the right to be the victim." Lines designed to wound, not end things cleanly. She had expected rage, maybe even confrontation. Instead, he left behind the kind of cruelty only someone who knows you deeply could craft. Precise, cold, targeted. She picked up the papers again, this time noticing the way he had highlighted certain clauses. His handwriting in the margins wasn't emotional, it was instructional. Almost smug. "Please sign and return by the end of the week." Like it was a business deal. No mention of the years they'd shared, no acknowledgement of the part he played in the breakdown, no regret. Just blame, masked as closure. She flipped the page over, hoping for something human. But there was nothing. Just a signature. His name, final and bold, like a stamp of victory. This wasn't a surrender. It was a silent declaration, "I win." She clenched her jaw. He hadn't left to free her. He'd left to shame her. He wanted the last word, the last move, the last power shift. And he knew this would hurt her more than yelling ever could. There had been 100 moments when she'd begged for honesty, for softness, for him to just listen without turning her words against her. He never gave her that. Until now. And now, it wasn't real honesty, it was manipulation, dressed up in closure. She sat down, the weight of the moment finally catching up with her. Everything about the setup was too calculated. The silence, the suitcase, the clean room. This wasn't a man who walked away. This was a man who staged his exit like a performance, knowing exactly what emotional damage it would leave behind. And yet she didn't cry. She'd already done that too many times. She'd cried into towels to muffle the sound. Cried in cars, bathrooms, parking lots. Cried after arguments she didn't start, after apologies she never received. Cried while brushing her teeth, while folding laundry, while pretending nothing was wrong. But now, all she felt was clarity. He hadn't left because she cheated. He left because she finally acted without fear. Because for once, she made a move he didn't control. And that terrified him. So he flipped the script. Made it about her failure, not his years of erasure. That letter wasn't an ending. It was a mirror he hoped she'd stare into, and see only shame. But she saw something else. She saw how small he wanted her to feel. How hard he tried to shrink her into a box labeled ungrateful wife. He wanted her to carry this affair like a scarlet letter, to drag it behind her as proof of her moral collapse. He wanted her to forget the years of gaslighting, the emotional neglect, the slow disintegration of her spirit. He didn't get to rewrite the story. She had spent so long questioning herself. Was she the problem? Was she unlovable? Too emotional? Not enough? But not once had she asked if maybe the love she craved, the tenderness, the respect, the safety, was never there to begin with. It wasn't love that faded. It was illusion. She stood up and began to pace. Not aimlessly, deliberately. Her mind moved faster than her feet now. For years she had stayed out of fear of being alone, of starting over, of admitting that the dream had died. But what if the real fear wasn't loneliness? What if it was facing the truth that she had wasted precious years on someone who only saw her as an extension of his ego? The realization didn't sting. It relieved her. Because now, everything made sense. The control. The subtle punishment. The charm that returned only when she pulled away. He never loved her. He loved having her. Owning her. Molding her. And the moment she slipped out of that mold, even if it was messy, even if it was wrong, he discarded her like a defective product. She picked up the suitcase. It was heavier than it looked. She unzipped it and found his clothes folded with surgical precision. Nothing sentimental. No notes. No photos. Just shirts, socks, shoes. He had left with efficiency, with intention. This was never a spontaneous decision. He had been planning this. Waiting for her to fail. Hoping she would, so he could exit righteously. The thought made her stomach turn. He had set a trap. And she had walked right into it. But instead of snapping shut around her, something unexpected happened. She stopped caring what it said about her. She stopped defending herself against the version of the story he'd already written. Because what mattered wasn't how the story looked, it was how it felt. And the truth was, she felt free. Not because she cheated. Not because he left. But because for the first time, she saw it all clearly. The manipulation. The control. The way he crafted his identity as the better half, while slowly chipping away at her worth. The affair hadn't broken the marriage. It had exposed it. Shown her that love built on fear, shame, and silence was never love at all. It was survival. And she was done surviving. She walked over to the table, picked up the divorce papers, and without thinking, she signed them. Not out of submission. Out of choice. He wanted this to be her punishment. But it wasn't. It was her liberation. She didn't need him to forgive her. She didn't need him to understand. She didn't even need to explain herself. She just needed to leave. Finally. Completely. On her terms. The papers were signed, but her mind was far from finished. That single act, pen to paper, should have brought peace. Instead, it sparked something else entirely. Not regret, not doubt. Power. A quiet, steady kind. Not the kind you scream about or post online. The kind that starts in your chest and spreads, slow but certain. She didn't pack her own bags. Not yet. She didn't rush to call a lawyer or vent to a friend. There was no impulsive decision to leave the next morning. This wasn't about escape anymore. It was about reclaiming control, calmly, intentionally, completely. She began noticing the things she used to overlook. How she walked differently now, shoulders less hunched. How her thoughts didn't orbit around pleasing someone else. How silence, once oppressive, now felt like a reset. Even the walls seemed to breathe easier. It was almost ridiculous how little he'd taken. A suitcase. A letter. That's all. But what he left behind was telling. The things he didn't value. Her books, her grandmother's old bracelet in the kitchen drawer, the half-finished painting she once started on a rare weekend alone. Things that didn't matter to him. Things that still held pieces of her. The more she looked around, the more she realized, This home had been hers all along. He just occupied it with noise and dominance. But the essence? The warmth, the style, the memories? Hers. She didn't reach for wine or distraction. She opened her journal. The one she used to hide under the mattress. She flipped through the entries, pages filled with apologies to herself, dated evidence of how long she'd been suppressing the truth. I'm exhausted but pretending not to be. I smiled even when I felt invisible. I'm afraid that if I leave, no one else will want me. Those words weren't dramatic. They were documentation. Survival notes. Quiet screams. Now, she read them like a witness. Not a victim. She saw the version of herself who clung so tightly to a dying relationship because she thought love meant staying, enduring, fixing. That version was brave but tired. She had always been told leaving was weakness. That giving up on marriage was selfish. That cheating defined you forever. But no one ever talked about what staying in the wrong relationship did to you, how it reshaped your identity, hollowed your soul, conditioned you to confuse toxicity for passion and control for love. She wasn't proud of the affair. But she refused to let it be the only headline in her story. It wasn't love that drove her to another man. It was deprivation. Years of not being seen, touched, heard. Years of being measured and found lacking. It didn't justify the choice, but it explained it. And that distinction mattered more than anyone would understand. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. But she owed herself honesty. It had taken infidelity for her to realize the truth, but the rot had been there long before. The affair didn't crack the foundation. It revealed that the foundation had never been solid to begin with. His letter had hoped to haunt her. Instead, it woke her up. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to envision a different future. One not built around catering to someone else's moods. One where she could be soft without being punished for it. One where her ambition wasn't a threat, where her silence wasn't demanded, where her love was returned, not tolerated. The idea of starting over no longer terrified her. It felt like a gift. She made a list, something she hadn't done in ages for herself. Not groceries. Not work tasks. A real list. What she wanted from life moving forward. Peace. Laughter. Friendships. A home that felt like safety, not surveillance. A relationship built on mutual admiration, not dependency. And more than anything, forgiveness. Not from him. From herself. Forgiveness for waiting so long. For shrinking. For forgetting who she was. For breaking under the weight of years of subtle, daily betrayal. That night, she cooked for herself. Something simple. But it tasted different. Like nourishment. Like something made for someone who mattered. She played music without worrying about the volume. She wore her softest pajamas and didn't worry about looking presentable. She wasn't being watched, judged, corrected. The quiet didn't scare her anymore. It was beginning to sound like peace. There was no cinematic moment of triumph. No overnight transformation. Just small shifts. A steadier breath. A clearer mind. A silence that didn't accuse. This was what healing looked like. Not loud. Not instant. But real. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But for the first time, she was walking toward herself instead of away. And that was enough to begin again. The days that followed didn't come with fireworks or breakdowns. Just stillness. The kind that demands attention. No more reacting, no more tiptoeing around moods or managing emotional minefields. The air felt different. The silence that once screamed now whispered clarity. She started waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. Mornings had a new rhythm, coffee she actually finished, moments she sat with instead of rushing through. She stopped checking her phone for his messages. They had once been the center of her world. Now, the silence between them felt earned. People began noticing. Her coworkers, her sister, the barista who had seen her tired eyes for years. They didn't ask questions. They just looked longer, softer, as if they sensed something had shifted but knew not to prod. She didn't advertise the divorce. She didn't tell anyone about the affair. That part was hers. Not because of shame, but because it didn't define her. It was part of the truth, but not the whole story. Instead, she focused on rebuilding. Not the version of herself she used to be. This wasn't about returning. It was about emergence. She revisited old hobbies. Not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. Sketching. Reading fiction. Taking solo walks at dusk, not fearing judgment for being alone. These weren't distractions. They were reclamations. The apartment felt less like a shell now. She moved the furniture. Took down the photos that had started to feel staged. She left the walls partially bare, not out of neglect, but patience. She didn't need to fill every space. She was learning to let things breathe. She also faced the aftermath head on. The guilt wasn't gone, it just stopped being the loudest voice. When it did rise, she met it with questions. Had she betrayed him, or had she betrayed herself by staying too long? Was it wrong to want to feel desired, seeing chosen? Those answers weren't simple, but they were becoming clearer. She hadn't been perfect. But perfection was never the standard she should have lived by. She had been human. Desperate. Wounded. And trying. She wrote him one last letter. Not to send, just to release. She didn't list grievances or defend herself. She didn't beg for understanding. She simply told the truth, that she had loved him once. That she had tried. That she had waited years for him to see her pain, to meet her halfway. And when she couldn't wait anymore, she broke. That's all. There was no anger in her words. Only finality. That was the real ending, not the divorce, not the letter he left, not the night she cheated. The ending was the moment she realized she no longer needed his validation to forgive herself. She spent more time alone, not in isolation but in restoration. There were no more roles to perform, no more energy spent pretending. If she felt sad, she allowed it. If she felt joy, she didn't question it. Her emotions became hers again, unfiltered, unpoliced. Sometimes she missed him. Or at least, the idea of him. The man she had fallen in love with in the beginning. But when those memories surfaced, she reminded herself that they were real, but not enough. A few good chapters don't make a story worth rereading. She had been loyal to a fantasy longer than to herself. She stopped romanticizing struggle. Stopped believing that pain was proof of love. She began setting boundaries, not as punishment, but protection. She redefined her standards, not higher, just healthier. Kindness without manipulation. Communication without punishment. Connection without control. She started therapy. Not to fix herself, but to understand. Patterns, beliefs, habits she hadn't noticed. She wanted to heal at the root, not just survive the surface. For once, she wasn't trying to be okay for anyone else. She was doing the work because she mattered. She journaled differently now. Less confession, more clarity. She wrote about her future. Not in vague hopes, but in clear choices. Where she'd travel. What kind of energy she'd allow into her space. The kind of love she'd accept if it came again, slow, honest, peaceful. She didn't rush back into dating. She wasn't afraid of love, but she was no longer starving for it. She finally understood that partnership should never cost your peace. That the right person won't make you beg for basic respect. One night, she stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not to criticize herself. Just to look. There were lines she hadn't noticed before. A tiredness under her eyes, sure. But also strength in her jaw, steadiness in her posture. She didn't look like a woman broken by betrayal. She looked like someone reborn through it. She realized she didn't need closure from him. She had given it to herself. Not in one dramatic moment, but in hundreds of tiny choices to keep going. To tell the truth. To stay with herself even when it was uncomfortable. The version of her who tolerated silence, who twisted herself to be more likable, who stayed quiet to keep the peace, she was gone. Not erased. Just evolved. She was finally becoming the woman she had once hoped someone else would give her permission to be. And now, she didn't need permission. She just needed to keep going. She didn't mark the day with a celebration. No balloons, no champagne. Just quiet recognition. It had been 6 weeks since the letter, and the final documents came in the mail, stamped, processed, done. Legally, emotionally, symbolically, the chapter was closed. And for the first time, the weight that once clung to her ribs didn't follow her to bed. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. It was more than relief. It was acceptance. The kind that doesn't demand explanation or permission. She no longer needed to justify what happened. Not to herself, not to anyone. The story was hers, and that alone made it valid. She had started walking every evening. Not for fitness or distraction. Just to move. To feel herself in motion. The rhythm of her feet against pavement reminded her she was still going forward. That even after all the chaos, her body knew how to keep moving. During those walks, she often replayed the red flags she once excused. The emotional shutdowns, the deflection, the way every argument twisted back to her flaws. At the time, she thought keeping the peace meant keeping the relationship. Now she understood, peace never had to come at the cost of her voice. People often asked, quietly, what really happened. She always gave vague answers. Not out of shame, but because most wouldn't understand. They wanted clean lines: who cheated, who left, who was right. But the truth was messier. It wasn't just one affair, one night, one letter. It was years of erosion. Of silent battles. Of trying to breathe in a room that kept shrinking. He had once told her she was too sensitive. Too reactive. Too needy. But now she could see those were traits he feared, not flaws she needed to fix. Her sensitivity had been wisdom. Her reactions had been alarms. Her needs had been entirely reasonable. He just wasn't capable of meeting them without losing control. The man she thought would protect her had trained her to fear honesty. And now, she was unlearning that fear, one truth at a time. She had started connecting with new people, slowly, cautiously, but openly. She met women with similar stories. Some still inside the pain, some long past it. They didn't give advice. They offered solidarity. That, more than anything, reminded her she wasn't alone. And had never been. What surprised her most was how much she no longer cared about what he thought of her. There had been a time when his opinion held the power to define her. Now, it felt distant. Dull. Like static she no longer tuned into. She had learned to sit with discomfort. Not run from it. Guilt no longer gripped her at night. It still whispered sometimes, but she'd grown stronger than its voice. She didn't deny her choices. She understood them. And that understanding gave her peace. She no longer needed to dissect the affair or over-explain what led to it. The truth was, she had been emotionally starving. And when you're starving, you reach for whatever keeps you alive. That didn't make her immoral. It made her human. Flawed, but not broken. She had also stopped waiting for him to apologize. For years, she held on to the fantasy that he might one day say, "I see now. I was wrong too." But he never would. And that was okay. Healing wasn't about making him see. It was about finally seeing herself. The idea of love didn't scare her anymore. She just respected it differently. She no longer confused intensity with intimacy. Love, she realized, should be gentle. It should feel safe, not suspenseful. She wrote a list one morning, not of goals, but of non-negotiables. Things she would never again sacrifice for a relationship. Her voice. Her peace. Her boundaries. Her joy. She folded the list and kept it in her journal, not because she'd forget, but because some promises deserved to be witnessed. She had stopped stalking his life online. The curiosity had faded. Whatever he was doing, whoever he was with, it no longer held power over her. What mattered was what she was building, not what he was pretending to be. She began saying no more often. To people who drained her. To things that didn't align. And every no felt like a brick placed back into her foundation. Stronger. Clearer. Sometimes she imagined running into him again. Not out of desire, but to test herself. She wondered if she'd flinch, crumble, rage. But deep down, she knew, she'd just nod and keep walking. Not out of coldness, but growth. Some stories don't need sequels. She had stopped performing. She didn't laugh to make others comfortable or nod when she disagreed. She said what she meant, even if it made things awkward. And strangely, that honesty drew the right people closer. Her reflection no longer surprised her. It resembled the woman she'd always wanted to be, unapologetic, calm, alive. Not perfect. Just whole. She understood now that betrayal doesn't begin with cheating. It begins with neglect. With silence. With the slow erasure of who you are. And healing doesn't end with moving on. It continues every day you choose yourself. She still had moments of doubt. Days that felt heavy. But they passed. And when they didn't, she allowed them to sit beside her without judgment. She had learned how to be alone without being lonely. How to find joy in ordinary things. How to trust herself again. And that, above all, was the point. Not the divorce. Not the affair. Not the pain. But the return to herself. To a life not built around fear, but freedom. She hadn't just survived. She had come home.